Imagine sitting alone in a five-star restaurant, dressed modestly, surrounded by polished marble floors and judgmental glances. You came to enjoy a quiet meal, not to defend your dignity. But suddenly, whispers rise, eyes narrow, and before you can finish your drink, someone accuses you of theft. No one asks questions, no one checks the facts, they just assume. A manager approaches with fake politeness, security stands behind him, and the entire room stares like you're a criminal. You didn't raise your voice, you didn't beg, you just sat there, heart-pounding, breath steady, trying to hold yourself together while they tore you apart. Not because of what you did, but because of what you looked like. They thought you were alone, powerless, but when her brother finds out what they did to her, everything changes. I walked into the restaurant, feeling like I had already committed a crime just by existing. Everything around me sparkled, the marble floors, the gold-accented furniture, the carefully arranged centerpieces on each table. It smelled like money in the air, subtle perfumes, fresh linen, power. I kept my head up and moved with purpose, even though every step felt like it echoed louder than it should. People didn't openly stare, not yet. But I could feel their glances, sharp and calculating, sneaking over their menus and wine glasses. I wasn't new to this kind of attention. I knew how to wear invisibility like armor. I clutched my small purse a little tighter and smiled politely at the hostess, pretending none of it touched me, pretending I belonged. The hostess barely glanced. At my reservation, her hands fumbled slightly, her voice strained as she asked me to wait a moment. I nodded, stepping aside as a couple dressed in designer clothes breezed past me and were seated without hesitation. I watched silently. I knew better than to make a scene. You learn after a while that dignity isn't loud, it's quiet. It's surviving moments like these without letting them see you bleed. After a few minutes, she returned and led me toward the back of the restaurant, near the swinging kitchen doors. Not the worst seat in the house, but definitely not where they sent people they wanted seen. I smiled again, sat down, and thanked her. My voice sounded foreign in my own ears. The waiter approached my table with a stiffness that wasn't there when he greeted the others. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I ordered water, keeping my tone pleasant, careful. There's a way you learn to soften your words, your movements, when you know people are looking for reasons to distrust you. I placed my purse gently on my lap, folded my hands neatly on the table, and waited. It wasn't a surprise when the discomfort in the room started to grow. Murmurs, side glances, a tension you could cut with a knife. I focused on my breathing, counting each inhale as if it were a lifeline. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. I had just opened the menu when it happened. A woman 2 tables away shrieked, loud and sudden, like someone had been attacked. "My wallet's missing!" she cried, her voice slicing through the quiet elegance like broken glass. Heads turned instantly, forks hovered in midair. The room shifted its weight onto me, unseen but undeniable. I froze, my heart kicking into my ribs. I hadn't moved. I hadn't spoken to anyone. I had just existed. And somehow, that was enough to make me guilty. I kept my hands where they were, visible, calm, but inside, the old familiar mix of anger and sadness twisted tighter. The manager appeared like a shark scenting blood. His approach was slow, calculated, every step designed to look measured, reasonable. He crouched next to my table, lowering his voice just enough that the entire restaurant strained to hear him. "Ma'am, would you mind opening your bag for us?" he asked, faux polite, the corners of his mouth twitching into a controlled smile. My pulse roared in my ears. I looked at him, steady and unmoving, and said a single word: no. No apology, no explanation, no fear, just no. It hung between us, thick and sharp. I watched as his mask cracked for a split second. A flicker of frustration. A flash of expectation denied. He stood up straighter, adjusting his jacket, then nodded as if my refusal were part of some script he had already written. Around me the room buzzed with whispers. I heard words like checker, security, and stealing hissed between the tables. No one questioned whether the woman accusing me might have misplaced her wallet. No one wondered if perhaps I was telling the truth. Their assumptions wrapped around me like a noose, pulling tighter with every second I stayed seated. I focused on the table in front of me, tracing the edges of the napkin with my fingertip. I wouldn't let them see me shake. I wouldn't give them that. I had been through worse, but the humiliation was a physical thing, a weight pressing against my chest. Every breath hurt, every glance cut. I heard the waiter behind me, speaking low into his headset, probably calling for backup. I wondered if they would drag me out in front of everyone. I wondered if they would let me explain first. Deep down, I already knew the answer. I could feel the tears threatening to spill over, but I blinked them back. If I cried, they would win. They would say I cried because I was guilty. They would say it was shame. They would twist it into something I couldn't undo. So I sat there, stone still, letting the anger pool inside me like molten lead. They thought they had already won. They thought they had put me in my place. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know who was coming. And soon enough, they would find out. As I sat there alone in a sea of polished judgment and casual cruelty, I realized something important. They didn't just accuse me of stealing a wallet. They stole something much bigger. They tried to steal my dignity, my humanity, my right to exist without suspicion. But they didn't realize dignity isn't something they could take from me. Not that easily. And when my brother found out what they did, I knew there would be a reckoning they would never forget. I stayed seated, my hands still folded neatly on my lap, my eyes locked onto the surface of the table. I heard the manager retreat, his footsteps heavy with annoyance, but the whispers around me only grew louder. I didn't have to look up to know that heads were turning, that fingers were pointing. The accusation had already stuck. It didn't matter if there was no proof. In their eyes, the verdict was in. My skin color was evidence enough. I took a slow, measured breath, willing myself not to react. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, to shout, to defend myself, but I knew better. Outbursts would only feed the narrative they were writing around me. The woman who had accused me began sobbing loudly, clutching her designer purse like it was the last thing anchoring her to reality. Her performance was perfect. The distressed victim, the trembling hands, the quivering voice. She pointed in my direction without actually pointing, her meaning clear enough to everyone in the room. The staff, emboldened by her tears, hovered closer to my table. I felt their presence like a tightening noose. They didn't see me as a customer anymore. I was a problem to be contained, an inconvenience they needed to remove quietly, without upsetting the delicate balance of their image. I noticed the security guard before he even reached me. Tall, broad, wearing a black suit that failed to make him look less threatening. He moved with purpose, his steps loud on the marble floors. My heart rate spiked, but I forced my face into stillness. I wouldn't give them anything they could twist into a reason to escalate. He stopped beside my table, cleared his throat, and asked to speak with me privately. The room went silent, every conversation dropping off like a switch had been flipped. I nodded once slowly and stood up, feeling the eyes of the room burn against my skin like open flames. They led me toward a side hallway, away from the main dining area, but still very much visible to the patrons, craning their necks to watch the show. I walked with measured steps, keeping my shoulders back, refusing to let them see how badly my hands were shaking. In the hallway, the security guard repeated the manager's request to check my belongings. His tone was rehearsed, detached, like he had said these words 100 times before. I asked again if there was any evidence that I had taken anything. He didn't answer directly. He just shifted uncomfortably and repeated the request. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of choice press down on me. I could open my bag, submit to their demands, and maybe they would leave me alone. Maybe they would mutter half-hearted apologies and let me slink out, bruised but not broken. Or I could refuse, stand my ground, and risk whatever consequences they were already preparing. I chose silence. I chose dignity. Without a word, I handed him my bag and crossed my arms, my chin lifting slightly. If they were going to treat me like a criminal, they were going to do it on full display. I wouldn't help them pretend it was polite. The security guard opened my bag with exaggerated care, pulling out each item like he was disarming a bomb. Wallet, phone, lip balm, a paperback novel, a receipt from a grocery store, nothing else, nothing even remotely resembling a stolen wallet. He rummaged through the lining, tapped the bottom, checked every zipper. I watched him the entire time, my expression unreadable. When he found nothing, he looked up at me, his mouth twisting into a tight line. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look embarrassed. He simply handed the bag back to me and mumbled something about procedures. I took the bag without a word, slipping it back onto my shoulder with slow, deliberate movements. I didn't trust myself to speak yet. Rage simmered under my skin, hot and heavy, but I kept it locked behind my teeth. I turned and walked back toward the dining room, feeling the heat of 100 silent accusations still clinging to the air. Nothing had been found, but nothing had been undone. In their eyes, innocence didn't erase suspicion, it only deepened it. I was guilty for being here, guilty for existing in a space they believed wasn't meant for me. When I reached my table again, my water had been removed. My menu was gone. It was a silent message. I wasn't welcome anymore. I sat down anyway, folding my hands in my lap, and waited. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me slink away like a thief. I deserved to be here as much as anyone else in that room, even if they refused to see it. I sat, tall, breathing in the thick, uncomfortable silence, and let it wrap around me like armor. They could stare, they could whisper. I wasn't moving. Minutes ticked by, each second stretching longer than the last. No one came to my table, no waiter, no manager, no apologies. They were hoping I would leave on my own, sparing them the discomfort of having to confront what they had done. But I stayed. I stayed because every fiber of my being screamed that running now would mean accepting their version of the story. And I refused. I had survived worse. I could survive this. Besides, I knew something they didn't. I wasn't as alone as they thought. And when my brother found out what happened, there wouldn't be a table big enough for the apologies they owed me. I sat at that small table, still and silent, while the restaurant buzzed around me with awkward energy. No one dared approach me directly anymore. They just glanced, whispered, turned their heads quickly when I looked up. It didn't matter. I wasn't there to perform for them. I wasn't there to explain myself. I sipped the water they had finally replaced, slow and measured, each movement calculated not to show a single crack. My heart still thundered in my chest, but on the outside I was ice. Let them look, let them wonder. I wasn't going to give them a show. I checked the time on my phone. It had only been 20 minutes since the accusation started, but it felt like I had aged years sitting there. The weight of it pressed against my skin like a physical force. I glanced at the entrance, watching couples laugh their way into the restaurant, oblivious to the silent battle raging across the room. Part of me wanted to stand up and scream, to demand justice, to shame every face that had turned against me without a second thought. But another part of me, the stronger part, knew that patience was my weapon now. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it walks in on quiet feet and rearranges the world without ever raising its voice. I pulled out my phone again, but this time not to check the time. I opened my contacts and tapped the name I knew would answer. I pressed the phone to my ear, my hand steady despite the adrenaline still rushing through my veins. 1 ring, 2 rings. He picked up immediately. "Hey," he said, his voice casual, warm, a sound that reminded me I wasn't alone. I swallowed down the lump in my throat and spoke carefully. "I need you to come here," I said, keeping my voice low. I told him the name of the restaurant, the address, a few clipped details. I didn't cry. I didn't explain everything. I didn't have to. He heard the tension in my voice. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "I'm on my way." The line went dead, and I placed the phone carefully back on the table. Across the room, I saw the manager glance at me, his expression a strange mix of irritation and unease. Good. Let him be uneasy. The storm was already coming. They just didn't know it yet. The minutes dragged by after that, each second sharpening the tension in the room. The hostess fidgeted behind her podium. The waitstaff whispered in corners, casting glances my way, like children daring each other to poke a sleeping lion. I kept my gaze fixed on the door, my posture relaxed, every nerve in my body burning beneath the surface. I imagined them wondering what I was waiting for. A cab, a fight, an apology. They had no idea what was coming, no idea who they had just humiliated in front of an entire room of strangers. When the door finally swung open, I felt it before I even saw him. That shift in the air, that ripple through the room, like the current had changed directions. Heads turned, conversations stumbled, and there he was, my brother, dressed in a tailored suit, moving with a quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it. His presence filled the space, pulled every gaze toward him like gravity itself had shifted. I watched the manager's face pale. Watched the hostess fumble with her notepad, watched the waiter who had searched my bag pretend to be busy. He spotted me instantly and moved toward my table, each step deliberate, unhurried. He wasn't there to make a scene. He didn't have to. His very existence made one. As he approached, the whispers changed, grew sharper, more curious. Who was he? Why did he move like he owned the place? I stayed seated, my hands folded neatly, in my lap, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the scrape of his shoes against the floor. When he reached my table, he didn't speak right away. He just placed a hand lightly on my shoulder, grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't alone anymore. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, but carrying enough weight to cut through the din. I nodded once, unable to find words for a moment. He turned then, scanning the room slowly, deliberately, as if memorizing every face, every slight. The manager took an uncertain step forward, opening his mouth to speak, but no words came out. My brother's gaze landed on him, pinning him in place like a butterfly under glass. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation could have been. No shouting, no demands, just presence. I felt the power shift then, real and tangible, like the tables themselves had tilted in our favor. They had tried to strip me down, to expose me, to shame me into silence. But they had underestimated me. Worse, they had underestimated who stood behind me. As I looked around at the wide eyes and nervous fidgeting, I realized something else. Too. They hadn't just misjudged me because of my skin, they had misjudged me because they thought I was alone. And soon they would realize just how big their mistake truly was. My brother didn't need to raise his voice. His silence did more damage than any shouting match ever could. He stood there for a moment longer, letting the weight of his presence settle over the room like a heavy fog. The manager finally found, his tongue stammering something about a misunderstanding and routine procedures. I stayed seated, my hands still in my lap, my face carefully neutral. I wasn't going to save them from the mess they had made. I wasn't going to soften the blow. This was their reckoning, not mine. "I understand," my brother said calmly, his voice smooth as steel. "You accused my sister of theft without a single piece of evidence." His words were simple, but they cracked. Across the room like thunder, conversations died mid-sentence. Even the clinking of silverware stopped. He didn't look angry. He looked focused, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with power. The kind of power that came from knowing you didn't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. The manager tried to laugh it off, a thin, brittle sound that didn't fool anyone. He blurted something about checking the security footage to clear everything up. My brother smiled then, slow, deliberate, chilling. "Good," he said. "Let's do that." I saw the blood drain from the manager's face because he hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected us to stay. He hadn't expected us to demand answers, to demand accountability. He had expected fear, embarrassment, retreat. Instead, he was facing something he couldn't control. The manager motioned for a server to fetch the head of security. I sat back in my chair, watching the panic spread through the staff like wildfire. They whispered furiously among themselves, exchanging wide-eyed looks. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending not to watch while hanging on every word. The waitress, who had earlier refused to meet my eye, now stared openly, her expression a complicated mess of guilt, fear, and something else. Recognition. Maybe finally she was starting to see me as human. It took several minutes for the security footage to be pulled up on a tablet. They crowded around it like children gathering around a secret, their faces tight and strained. My brother didn't move from my side. He didn't need to see the footage. He already knew what it would show. I could see the flicker of realization spread across their faces as they watched. I hadn't touched anything. I hadn't moved from my table. I hadn't even looked in the direction of the woman who had accused me. The evidence was there, undeniable, brutal in its simplicity. The manager cleared his throat again, his hands fidgeting with invisible lint on his jacket. "It seems there was a mistake," he said, voice strained, barely audible. My brother tilted, his head slightly studying him like a scientist observing a failed experiment. "No," he said, "it seems there was a decision, one you all made together." His words weren't loud, but they carried across the room like a blade slicing through fabric. The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. No one moved, no one spoke. They were trapped in their own shame. The woman who had made the accusation shifted nervously in her seat, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't apologize. Of course she didn't. People like her rarely did. But she couldn't meet my eyes either. She couldn't pretend anymore that she was the victim in this story. My brother didn't bother addressing her. He wasn't here for her. He was here for me, for every silent wound they had tried to inflict, for every moment they had tried to strip away my dignity. "I expect a public apology," my brother said finally, his voice low and calm. "Right here, right now." The manager opened his mouth, closed it again, and then turned to face the dining room. His voice shook as he announced to the entire restaurant that a mistake had been made, that I was innocent, that the staff and management extended their sincerest apologies. It was awkward. It was hollow, but it was public. And for the first time that evening, the shame wasn't mine to carry. I sat through the apology, without blinking, without nodding, without offering them even a scrap of forgiveness they didn't deserve. I wanted them to remember this moment, to feel it sear into their memories every time they looked at someone like me and made assumptions. My brother stayed by my side, silent and unmovable, a shield forged not of anger, but of undeniable truth. They had tried to erase me with suspicion. Instead, they had exposed themselves for what they truly were. When the apology ended, my brother offered me his arm. I rose slowly, with deliberate grace, and took it. We didn't rush. We didn't run. We walked through that restaurant like we owned every inch of it, heads held high, while the world they had tried to build on prejudice and fear crumbled silently around us. And I knew as I crossed that floor and felt every gaze burn into my back that this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. We made it to the lobby before the manager, breathless and desperate, hurried after us. He stammered something about wanting to make things right, but the words were clumsy, hollow. My brother didn't stop walking. He didn't even glance back. I matched his stride, feeling stronger with every step away from that poisoned room. Let them chase us. Let them scramble to fix what they had broken. They were already too late. The damage wasn't just to me. It was to themselves. And soon the world would know it. At the entrance, a valet scrambled to open the door. My brother paused then, turning slowly, deliberately. The manager nearly stumbled into him, caught off guard by the sudden stillness. "You don't even know who you just humiliated, do you?" my brother asked, voice calm, dangerous in its simplicity. The manager's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Around us, a few guests had drifted closer, pretending to check their phones while hanging on every word. The tension in the air was electric. "My name is Darius Carter," my brother said, letting the words drop like stones into a still pond. I watched the manager's face as recognition flickered and then exploded across it. His eyes widened. His mouth twitched. The blood drained from his face completely. Darius Carter, CEO, philanthropist, a name tied to millions of dollars in investments, scholarships, programs designed to lift communities like the very one that restaurant pretended not to see. A man whose name carried weight, power, influence, the kind that couldn't be ignored. The manager stumbled over an apology, words spilling out too fast, too late. "Mr. Carter, if we had known, we're so sorry." My brother cut him off with a slight raise of his hand. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "You needed to know who I was before you decided to treat her with basic respect." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It echoed in the marble halls, in the sudden silence that gripped every soul within earshot. No one dared to breathe too loudly. No one dared to look away. I watched it all with a strange detachment, as if it were happening on a stage, and I was merely a witness. Part of me wanted to scream, to cry, to rage against the injustice of it all. But a bigger part of me, the part that had been built, tested and sharpened by years of living in a world that measured me by my skin before it measured me by my soul, stayed cold, stayed still. I didn't need their pity. I didn't need their shame. Their regret was their own burden to carry now. Security guards hovered awkwardly nearby, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. Staff members whispered furiously behind the hostess stand. Somewhere deep inside the building, I imagined the owners frantically calling lawyers, spinning scenarios where this didn't end in a public relations disaster. I almost laughed. They had built their brand on exclusivity, luxury, refinement. And yet, all it had taken was one moment, one woman they decided didn't fit, to expose how fragile that illusion really was. My brother slipped a business card from his jacket pocket and handed it to the manager. "You'll be hearing from our legal team," he said simply, "and from the media. You might want to prepare a real apology by then." The manager's hand shook as he took the card. He tried to speak again, but the words crumbled in his throat. My brother turned away, his dismissal complete, and I followed him out into the cool night air without a backward glance. Some doors aren't worth closing gently. The valet brought the car around, a sleek black machine that purred like a panther. My brother opened the passenger door for me, his movements unhurried, dignified. I slid into the seat, feeling the weight of the evening start to lift off my shoulders. As he pulled away from the curb, I looked back once, just once, at the restaurant fading behind us. It sat there, glittering under the streetlights, a monument to small minds and smaller hearts. And somewhere inside, they were scrambling, panicking, realizing the size of the storm they had called down upon themselves. We drove in silence for a while, the city lights blurring past the windows. I watched them, feeling something inside me settle. Not peace exactly, but something close. Vindication, not because they knew who my brother was, but because for once they had been forced to see me, forced to confront the ugliness they carried behind polite smiles and designer suits. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how much they tried to pretend otherwise, they would never forget me. The fallout started faster than I expected. Less than 24 hours after we left that restaurant, the story had spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a rumor whispered behind closed doors. It was headlines, viral posts, heated comment sections, exploding with rage. Someone had recorded the whole encounter on their phone, the accusation, the refusal to apologize, the public humiliation. And once it hit the internet, no carefully worded statement could contain the damage. They had built their reputation on luxury and excellence. Now, they were the face of discrimination. I watched it all unfold from the safety of my brother's apartment, sipping coffee while news anchors dissected every detail. Renowned entrepreneur's sister wrongfully accused at prestigious restaurant. The headlines screamed from every screen. Interview requests flooded in. Commentators demanded boycotts. Influencers piled on, eager to be part of the outrage. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The footage spoke louder than I ever could. Every tear I hadn't cried, every scream I hadn't unleashed, it was all there, etched into the cold, undeniable lens of a stranger's phone. The restaurant issued an apology, of course. Several, actually. The first one was laughably vague, a vague regret for any inconvenience experienced. The second tried to spin the narrative, blaming miscommunication and unfortunate misunderstandings. By the third, they were begging. Full-page letters in newspapers, tearful press conferences. It didn't matter. The damage was done. Once trust is broken like that, it doesn't heal with pretty words. It scars, it brands. It lingers in every whispered conversation and every cautious side-eye. Their reservation books emptied overnight. Patrons cancelled en masse, some loudly, some quietly. Online reviews tanked their ratings within days. Wouldn't dine where racism is served as the first course, one scathing comment read. Every polished image they had crafted, the glowing ads, the celebrity endorsements, the socialite parties, collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. They thought they were untouchable. They thought image could shield them. They learned otherwise, painfully, publicly. My brother never once gloated. He didn't post smug tweets or stage triumphant interviews. He didn't need to. His silence was its own kind of statement, louder than any words could ever be. He had already said everything that mattered the night he stood beside me without raising his voice. Real power doesn't shout. It stands still and watches the walls fall down around it. And I understood, sitting there beside him, that this wasn't just about what happened to me. It was about what happens every day to people who don't have a Darius Carter to walk through the door. Every message of support, every angry demand for justice was a reminder that change didn't come from one viral moment. It came from 1,000 small, steady refusals to be silent. It came from standing your ground even when the ground feels like it's crumbling under you. I hadn't asked for this spotlight. I hadn't sought out this battle. But once it found me, I had refused to shrink beneath it. And now, even though the wounds were still fresh, I realized something important. Survival wasn't enough anymore. Visibility mattered. A few days later, reporters camped outside the restaurant full-time. The owners tried to rebrand, to change their name, to wipe away the stain. It didn't work. People remembered. People always remember when masks slip. They remember when they see the truth beneath the polish. I wasn't naive enough to believe this one incident would fix everything, but for a moment at least, the veil had lifted. And they couldn't shove it back down, no matter how many statements they issued or donations they made. One evening, scrolling through my phone, I saw a post that stuck with me. Someone had shared the video with the caption, "They thought she was nobody. Turns out she was everybody." It hit me harder than anything else had, because that was it. I wasn't just myself anymore. I was standing for every glance, every accusation, every polite exclusion dressed up as policy. And they couldn't unsee it. They couldn't unknow it. They would carry that discomfort with them into every future decision. There was no satisfaction. in their downfall. No joy in watching their empire crack, just a quiet, heavy truth settling into my bones. They had tried to erase me. Instead, they had made me unforgettable. And no matter how much money they threw at the mess they made, no matter how many PR firms they hired to scrub their image clean, there would always be a shadow at the edge of their reputation. A reminder of the night they tried to break someone and broke themselves instead. I didn't celebrate their downfall. There were no parties, no champagne, no late-night calls of, "Did you see what happened today?" I moved through my life the same way I always had, quietly, deliberately, with a calm they never expected from me. The victory wasn't theirs to witness. It was mine to carry, deep and silent. Their shame didn't heal the bruises they tried to leave on my spirit. It didn't erase the moment when a roomful of strangers decided I was guilty just for existing. But it did something almost as important. It proved, once and for all, that silence is never consent. Every time a headline mentioned their collapse, I barely reacted. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I just kept walking forward, knowing that the world had seen something they could no longer unsee. The illusion had shattered, and even if they repainted the walls and changed the curtains, the cracks would still be there, for everyone to notice if they looked closely enough. Sometimes survival isn't loud. Sometimes it's just refusing to disappear. I hadn't screamed for attention. I hadn't begged for justice. I had simply refused to be erased. Friends reached out, some offering congratulations, others offering apologies for never realizing how bad it really was. I accepted both with a nod and a tight smile, but inside, I understood something most of them never would. It wasn't about this one night. It wasn't about one restaurant, or one manager, or one lost wallet. It was about every moment before, and every moment after. A lifetime of carrying suspicions stitched into my shadow. They hadn't created the wound. They had just torn it wide open where the world could finally see it. My brother checked in often, more than he used to. Quiet texts, short calls, not smothering, not hovering, just there, like a hand ready to catch me if I slipped. He never brought up the restaurant unless I did. He understood that some victories come coated in ash, that sometimes winning feels like losing something softer, more invisible, the ability to pretend it couldn't happen. I loved him for that, for standing beside me without asking me to perform strength I didn't always feel. I returned to normal routines faster than people expected. Grocery shopping, walking through parks, visiting cafes. At first, I wondered if people recognized me, if the sideways glances were curiosity or suspicion. But over time, I stopped caring. I wasn't living for their approval. I never had. I moved through the world with the quiet knowledge that I had survived something meant to silence me, and in surviving, I had made myself louder than any slander could. One afternoon, passing by a bookstore, I saw a photo of the restaurant taped to the window. "Closed for renovations," the sign read. I didn't stop. I didn't need to take a picture or post a story or commemorate the moment. Some endings don't need announcements. Some victories don't need to be shared with the ones who tried to break you. I tucked the memory away like a stone in my pocket. Small, solid, permanent. People asked if I would ever go back there, if I would walk through those doors again just to prove I could. I always gave the same answer, calm and unshaken. No, I didn't need to reclaim anything. I hadn't lost anything that mattered. I hadn't been diminished. They had. Their character, their dignity, their carefully manufactured image, that was what had crumbled under the weight of their own prejudice. I had nothing to prove to them, or to anyone else. When I thought about that night now, it wasn't anger that filled me. It was a kind of bittersweet clarity. They had shown me, in the sharpest, most painful way possible, exactly who they were. And in doing so, they had freed me. Freed me from the burden of wondering if I was imagining it. Freed me from second-guessing my instincts. Sometimes the mask has to slip completely for you to see the truth. And once you see it, you can't ever unsee it. I didn't need to shout my story from rooftops. I didn't need revenge painted in neon lights. My existence, whole, unbroken, unbowed, was the loudest revenge of all. I had survived their judgment, their suspicion, their casual cruelty. I had stood when they expected me to fall. And in the quiet that followed, I realized something beautiful. Survival wasn't enough. Existence wasn't enough. I would thrive, not because they gave me permission, but because I had always been more than they could ever imagine. I learned something that night, something no headline could capture and no apology could erase. Survival is not just about enduring the storm. It's about learning to stand in the rain without shrinking. It's about refusing to hand over pieces of yourself to people who never deserved to hold them in the first place. They tried to define me with suspicion. They tried to shrink me down to a single moment of humiliation. But I was always more than their assumptions could grasp. And now they knew it too. There's a particular kind of power in knowing you never needed their approval, that their acceptance was never the prize. I moved forward with that knowledge stitched into my spine. Every step I took afterward was quieter but stronger. Every room I entered carried the memory of what I had survived and what they had failed to destroy. I didn't wear bitterness like a cloak. I wore resilience like armor. They couldn't tear it away. They couldn't stain it with their shame. When I thought back to that restaurant, to that long, humiliating evening, I didn't feel rage anymore. I felt clarity. I saw every small decision that led them to that moment. Every assumption, every whispered judgment, every reflex to accuse instead of understand. They didn't know me. They didn't even want to. But now their ignorance wasn't hidden behind luxury and politeness. It stood exposed, raw, and undeniable for the world to see. They had unmasked themselves. I had merely stayed standing. My brother once told me that dignity isn't given. It's claimed. It's fought for in 1,000 small, invisible battles. That night wasn't the first battle, and it wouldn't be the last. But it mattered. Not because of the headlines, not because of the apologies. It mattered because I refused to vanish. I refused to let them rewrite my story. I refused to let them turn me into a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. I lived loudly in my silence. I existed defiantly, without permission. The world loves to pretend that change happens in grand gestures, protests, speeches, marches, but sometimes change starts with one person refusing to move, one person refusing to nod and smile and pretend it's okay. I hadn't planned to be that person that night. I just wanted dinner. I just wanted peace. But sometimes peace costs more than you're willing to pay. And when it does, you have to decide if you'll let the world fold you into a shape that fits its comfort, or if you'll unfold yourself, even when it hurts. I chose to unfold, to take up the space they tried to deny me, to exist without apology in a world that demanded my silence. And in doing so, I forced them, all of them, to see me, not as a suspect, not as a threat, not as an inconvenience, but as a human being who refused to disappear. Some part of them would carry that memory forever, whether they admitted it or not. And that was enough. That was more than enough. In the quiet moments that followed, in the slow days where the world seemed to settle back into its patterns, I held on to that knowledge like a compass. I didn't need every room to be safe. I didn't need every heart to be open. I only needed to remember who I was before they tried to strip it away. And every time fear whispered that I should lower my head, that I should shrink, I remembered the truth. Survival is not silence. Survival is standing taller. They thought that night would break me. They thought humiliation would bend me into something smaller, something easier to ignore. But they didn't understand the kind of strength you build when you're forced to carry your own dignity through fires no one else sees. They didn't understand that every step I took away from that restaurant was a declaration. I am still here. I'm still standing, and I will not be erased In the end, the real story wasn't about a stolen wallet. It wasn't about a ruined reputation or a viral video. It was about endurance, about the quiet, unbreakable resilience of someone who refused to accept the world's shallow definition of worth. I walked out of that restaurant that night, not just undefeated, but transformed. And I carried that transformation with me into every room, every conversation, every silent battle still waiting ahead.